Stanford University.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, founder and director of Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design program. This session, titled Faith, Pain, and the Faraway, a meditation on landscape painting, is provided to us by Professor Alexander Nemerov. Professor Nemerov is the Carl and Marilynn Thomas Provostial Professor in the Arts and Humanities at Stanford. His next book, The Forest, a Fable of America in the 1830s, will be published by Princeton University Press in the fall of 2022. His previous publications include Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler in 1950s New York. It was praised as thrillingly alive by Vogue, masterful by Los Angeles Review of Books, and gorgeous by Newsday, and lyrical and powerful were the words used by Susan Stamberg of NPR. Welcome, Professor Nemerov.
Thank you, Tia. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor, in fact. I'm on sabbatical this year, and this is the first talk I've given on sabbatical, and I consider it a great opportunity to share with you for just a few minutes today some remarks about something we maybe take for granted, which is landscape painting, maybe take for granted in the best way, in the sense of finding it a space and a place of contemplation, of enjoyment, as against difficulties of our lives. And I suppose that is what I want to talk about today, but in a way that maybe makes the difficulty and the beauty combine, and hopefully make what it is when I use the word contemplation become that much richer, and when I make the word art richer as well. So what I'd like to do by way of talking about this is to bring you into one of our local museums, the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park. I'm sure many of you have been there, and to take you to the second floor and to a very large room there on the western part of the museum, which contains many American landscape paintings. And if you try to put yourself in the position of these two visitors inspecting these pictures, though arguably probably inspecting the labels about the pictures rather than the pictures, you can understand that paintings like this, I see 6 of them in this one slide, but there's probably as many as 30 paintings in this room, have a kind of generic quality. You know, they're landscape paintings, right? And we can see that, you know, they all have a horizon that's either low or high. Most of them are low. On the canvas, there are different things to think about, but that's about it. But I'd like to take you in just as an experiment to one of these, and it's maybe one of the most innocuous ones. This painting here by this artist, Sanford Gifford, who is my focus for today. So this is that innocuous painting I referred to, a view from the Berkshire Hills near Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Those of you who are from the East will know that this is in Western Massachusetts. It was painted in 1863. Gifford was about 40 years old at that time. And you might say, well, this is interesting. I can already see this as a contemplative picture. Nonetheless, my heart is sinking, despite all the credentials of the professor and so on, that we're going to look at this, because there's not a lot going on in it. But I suppose this is why I try to teach my students that attention is grace, perception is grace, that things come to us and for us when we attend, when we look. And in the case of this picture, just looking at some details, for example, in this lower left corner, There is a shepherd with his flock here, and then these trees flaming into fall foliage. You can see the distant, the hills in the medium and then far distance behind. You can see the shadows that are cast by the setting sun there as the shepherd appears to walk down towards them. Just moving, scanning a little bit to the right, you can see these marvelous effects, really, which must have taken a great deal of skill and attention to bring off. For example, the shadow reflections of this mid-ground hill against the stillness of the water there. And then you can see the brushwork in this field here, not to mention this zag of stream leading to the water in the foreground. And then moving back and over to the right, you can see more of the like preternaturally clear water, which barely is rippled, maybe just slightly here at the tip of this jutting promontory of dirt or sand. And then there is a little farm over here with different plowed fields if one looks closely, but also into the distance, you know, and the diaphanous really disappearance of the furthermost of the Berkshires as they vanish in the setting sun. And then up above it all is something we take for granted, and this is so much what I try to teach my students and myself every day is, you know, it's the sun. Well, yes, technically to say that the sun is in the sky in this painting is correct, but, you know, there are all kinds of suns, and this one is a kind of, you know, indistinct, but all-encompassing sun with a kind of enormous radiance that shines down on the scene. And, you know, all the different ways to paint the sun. Gifford was a fan and admirer of atmosphere, or what we might call less poetically haze. So if we're just pausing here, we might say, well, it's nice to have spent a little time with this picture, whether we've been to the Berkshires or not, because we can see that it is a particular kind of landscape painting. It has a particular attitude, a particular mood. And, you know, as you take in the whole picture now, I think maybe that is more palpable. What is that mood? It's based on a kind of suspension of time, the sun kind of hanging in the air, but also time somewhat melancholically passing. It's the autumn, but everything is poised in this kind of stillness for which the glistening glass sheet of the foreground lake is maybe an apt indicator. Right? And to just to suggest how there is no such thing as landscape painting in a generic sense. We only need to turn 180 degrees from looking at this painting in that gallery in San Francisco to a painting on the opposite wall, which is about 2.5 times the size. So the Gifford is 22 by 36 inches, and this is 56 by 84 inches, painted by his Hudson River colleague, Frederick Church, who was his exact contemporary. They were both born in 1823, Gifford and Church. This painting, a much more extravagant picture called Rainy Season in the Tropics, which Church painted the year after the Civil War, and which, among other things, has to do with a kind of heavenly covenant between two sides, a more vegetal and smaller side here, modeled on the artist's trips to the island of Jamaica, and then this more massive granite realm on the left. So some kind of allegory about the end of the Civil War, perhaps. But the thing I want to emphasize most is just the Spielbergian nature of this landscape painting. This is meant to be a showstopper, a kind of, sense around explosive, spectacular scene. And if you look at the relative sizes of the pictures, again, you can see that already we can understand that there is no such thing as landscape painting proper. There's really different kinds, and in America, in the same time and place, you have a kind of poetic private mood on the left and a big public spectacular mode on the right. And to stay with Church there, that is the painter of Rainy Season in the Tropics, the rainbow picture, this was his mode pretty much as he became famous in the 1850s and 60s. And this painting at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Heart of the Andes, is another one of these showstoppers. You can see the size of it. And in fact, if you go back in time and look at the way this same painting was displayed, this is Heart of the Andes, complete with the curtains and then the triumvirate of presidents above it. It is a public picture meant for public display and is meant to say something about the American nation, as well as, this part of the globe too, because it's a South American scene painted by a North American painter. So having to do with territorial ambition and sovereignty and might, landscape painting is very public in that way. You might say, well, how was this smaller kind of painting used, Professor? And it's a very good question. And I just love this painting, which is also at the Metropolitan, a painting not by Gifford, but showing there on the wall, and also here, the kind of painting that Gifford made, that is these private paintings, private landscape paintings, destined for the homes of consumers, for example, the upper middle class who could afford them, such as Robert Gordon and his family in this painting, with children playing at a wedding game there in the dining room of this fancy New York house. There's even I think that is a fernery, which is like part of the craze, as much as the craze for landscape painting, the craze for ferns then and there. So, the private paintings are meant for private consumption, but they have their own social role too. They're meant to adorn the halls of affluence. And, if we're coming out into the clear, back to the painting at the De Young, we might say, okay, well, this is then a picture that, illuminates for us what our own lives are like, because whether we're doctors or artists or art historians, anyone, we are accustomed to portioning our lives into public and private scenarios and schemes. Just in my own, hasty adjustment of my background in my Zoom here, it illustrates the awkwardness of Zoom as something that mediates between private and public, since I'm giving this talk from my own home, and since, I needed to think about before I went on air, like, well, how do I want to be represented by what's behind me? In any case, so, in the 1860s, we have very much in the realm of art, exactly what we spend our lives doing and structuring our existence according to even now, which is the private, inmost, contemplative, moody, sunstruck self. Call it, looking at Gifford, the soul, our inmost sense, and then our dreamy sense, if you like, and then the public kind of rainbow spectacular that we present for the world at large. With Gifford, I want to press on this distinction a little bit further and take us into his soul, his dream, his privacy, and, think about the ethics and practice of this kind of quietness in our lives now, and thereby to say that landscape painting is more than a pretty picture on the wall, more than a historical artifact, if we choose it choose to make it more than this. It tends to address us, if we look closely, with something like urgency about who we are and how we are in our lives. So with Gifford, let's go back to where he grew up, and you can see from this photograph from the late 19th century that he grew up in a place of wealth, that is a family of wealth. His father was the president, the manager of an iron foundry in the town of Hudson, New York, which was an extremely affluent place on the Hudson River. And his father was a very successful industrialist running this foundry in the prosperous town of Hudson, which had many businesses, including, believe it or not, the industry of whaling, since the whaling port in the United States, the chief whaling port in the United States, had been transferred from coastal New England to the Hudson River in the late 18th century as a sort of security precaution against the raids of the British upon that vital American industry. And so whaling ships are coming up the Hudson all the way until the 1820s or so, but other industries come to take their place, and the foundry is one. And Elihu Gifford, Sanford Gifford's father, is a very enlightened guy, and he encourages his sons, in particular Sanford and an older son named Charles, to pursue artistic interests. In other words, they shouldn't feel absolutely beholden to, following in the industrialist line. And one thing I find very touching about this story of Charles, the older brother Charles, and Sanford being interested in art is the way Charles, who was really the leader in this, purchased this book of prints from the National Gallery. They were prints that had just been established or made from the National Gallery in London. And you see one on the right from a 17th century painting by Claude Lorrain. You have to imagine these two teenagers in America in the 1830s kind of pouring through, or early 1840s, pouring through these prints like the one on the right of famous European paintings there in Hudson, New York. And here is another comparison showing on the right one of the prints that Charles and Sanford saw. So on the left is John Constable's painting The Cornfield, which, like the Claude painting you can see at the National Gallery to this day, with the curious detail of, I always find it a very arresting detail of this boy slaking his thirst at this pond, this pool here, face down on the earth, which you can see is reproduced here in David Lucas's engraving, which is what Charles had a copy of. So many things to think about here as these two neophytes in Hudson, New York become interested in art. And there they are. If anything might persuade you that Sanford's brother Charles was an artist, I think this photograph might do it, because he seems to epitomize a kind of sensitive figure, right? And there's our artist on the left. And what I want to emphasize here, and this is very much related to our question about soul and inwardness, and art, then, but also now, is to think about how close these brothers were, and how, in a way, you could say Charles, who was so interested in actually landscape design and wanted to be a landscape architect, was in Sanford. And I'm really haunted by this double self-portrait that Sanford Gifford, our artist, made a little later in the 1850s, which in one sense just shows what it says, that is him twice over, Same guy, different persona, both times in a very intense romantic way with the stare back out at us, first in the mirror at himself in the act of drawing, but really finally for posterity out at us, right? And, you might think this is two kind of personae of the artist, as doctors have personae too, as we all do. Maybe I won't try to understand or interpret exactly what is connotated by each of the gazes, but they're two different versions of the same person. But what I'm thinking too is that in a way, one of these figures, I don't know or don't even care which one, is Charles, that this double self-portrait is a picture of the brother as present in the other brother, right? And apart from just the closeness of siblings, I'm thinking of this phrase from an artist from the 1990s, Martin Wong, who died of AIDS, who used to pass out business cards in Manhattan with his saying on it, which is, I am you, you are too. I am you, you are too, which can suffice as a kind of caption for what's implied in this double self-portrait by our artist, especially because, well, Charles died relatively young. He died in 1860, and he died of a drug overdose. And the drug in question was something called chloral hydrate, chloroform, I believe, which was introduced into medical practice in the 1840s. And like drugs in our own days that have a benign and helpful restorative purpose, can also be abused. And the world in which our painting at the De Young took shape is in a way no different from ours. It's one that has to do with addictions and depression and pain. Charles suffered from depression and also migraines, and I think he was just over medicating when he died out in Wisconsin, where he had moved. The constable comes back to me. This is just my own projection or poetry, if you like, but as a sign of the death of the young man who loved this picture, this idea of going under, which we describe for anesthesia, chloroform, going under, just has a kind of poignancy for me, at least, when I think of Charles, who's the kind of unknown Gifford, but probably every bit as talented or more so than his admiring, idolizing younger brother, Sanford, whose paintings then, starting the year his brother dies, start to take on this, I don't know, they become, what can I say, his great paintings. And part of what I guess I'm wondering about tonight is there a correlation between paintings like this one, painted the year Charles died, painting at the Toledo Museum of Art by Sanford Robinson Gifford, The Wilderness, which in a way is my favorite of all his pictures, and his brother's death. And you might say, well, how could that be? And, it's true, there's no, art is, unlike journalism or politics, is not about answers, it's more about questions. But, art is a kind of atmospheric place in which questions are posed. And here a question might be, that of the distance, the far away, per my title. And just, a picture that can be about something that is a part of our world, but so remote, a part of our world that is up against the sky, that is sort of synonymous with the light, with the heaven that illuminates it, that's brought close to us in this reflection on this glassy lake. Or other pictures about distance that Gifford painted, such as this one 6 years after his brother's death, which is at Yale, another Hudson River scene, but one in which we not only get another glimpse of the distance, but also understand the distance as in some mysterious communing with the foreground, because so, as one of my professors used to say, the foreground, this spit of beach, kind of slingshots us out into the distance, and we might say very casually, like in a scenic overlook, or just thinking about a lot of things for which the word distance might apply, it's over there. It's way over there. If you look, it's way over, look just to the, way over there. But I think what Gifford is interested in, and I just love this about him, is the relation, not the difference, but the relation between near and far. What is so far from us and yet connected to us by, as it were, the same spit of land? What is intimate about the horizon? Why does the horizon shift with our own bodily position, as though, which of course it does, as though, the very circumference of the earth depends upon our subjective movements, and what is it about something that is so far away that is so urgent, so pertinent to us? And so if we come back to our painting and think about it, the distance is certainly in play there, but so of course is the light, and there's no question that that light is a heavenly light. Gifford, when he died at age 57, Sanford himself, on his deathbed, he was telling people, and this is in a letter from a friend, that there's no question he'll be in heaven. And, that kind of serene assurance about an afterlife is in his pictures too. So that light, that suffusing, irradiating light, which makes a heaven on earth and tends to kind of collapse the distinction between the sky and the ground, right, is enough to suggest that in addition to the distance, this painting speaks to the presence of the otherworldly, or the departed, let's say, in our here and now, and that part of the privacy, the soul, the inwardness, all of these things that I was talking about, that Gifford is meditating on, and that I'm meditating about tonight, have to do with this mysterious connectivity between who is here and who is not, who is nearby and who is far away, and what are the mystic avenues of pain that connect us, as well as of fellow feeling and kind of gorgeous, fragile love. And if you really sort of peer up almost obscenely, like too forensically up close to this canvas, to say the sun, where the sun appears, it's fair to say that the sun appears and it's not appearing. It's kind of a haze, a mist, an atmosphere, as I said, never quite the self-same sun, the identifiable, blithely nameable sun. Oh, that's the sun. Oh, that means that it's God the Father up there. No, it's not that simple. It's sort of bordering on invisibility, or it is invisibility made manifest as a kind of eruption or halo of light, and that it's a tall thing, a magnificent thing, a quiet thing too, for a painter to put into service that which we might think of as just a kind of incidental escape from the hardships and deep thought that life entails. Put all that into a painting and make it now be powerful. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and if you follow this idea that painting, wow, landscape painting is actually philosophical, not in some horribly dry sense, but in the sense of immediately putting before us questions that are elemental, primal, questions of near and far, questions of life and death. You can, armed with a little bit of biographical knowledge about Gifford, look at this picture of Catterskill Clove in the Catskills and see that here again, it's the distance, the relation of near to far, the falls, the waterfall in the distance, the reciprocity between this plateau and that one, overwritten, overseen by this bursting, bright but kind of formless sun, but also the valley itself, the valley of the Catskills here, which to me at least suggests a kind of cup or embracing pair of arms, or to put it less anthropomorphically, it's a hollow, as if to say that being fully present on earth in a moment is about feeling the connectivity of near and far, of heaven and earth, but also of fullness and hollowness, of what is there and what is not there. That this full scene sort of is cupped or held in the way that liquid is in a cup, and that as we slake our thirst, we are grateful not only for the water, but for the container that holds it. And this painting, just to give you a sense of it, is, I think, the biggest painting that Gifford ever made. And you can see it right there in this installation photograph. And, in a way is sort of his maybe his grandest statement about what he could do. And, part of what I'm saying here is that let us absolutely not sort of say, well, his brother died and he painted this. It's never that simple. The painting is never the artist's biography. It's never that simple. If you look at Jackson Pollock's paintings, it's not correct to say he died in a self-inflicted car crash, 80 miles an hour around a bad turn of road, wasted out of his mind in the Hamptons in 1956. And so look at his painting and there you go. I think we all know better than to make a strict connection between artist's life and artist's work. But at the same time, could the person who painted this picture have made the same picture without his brother's presence and absence in his life? I doubt it. There's something in it, a nameless something, as nameless as the sun, that infuses it, that determines it. And you know what? If 99 out of 100 of us walk by this painting without looking at it, as I myself have done plenty of times in my life, because we're all human and we're not, as it says on my computer, we're not robots. Hey, that's an occupational hazard of being an artist, right? You don't pander, you paint the truth, and then sometimes people happen upon it. I did want to say about this, since we might be thinking, well, who is this guy Gifford really, beyond what the professor is saying, and kind of what kind of attitude towards being alive, let alone being a painter, does his whole way of, let's call it, painting the soul entail? And there is a painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, not by him, which I think can offer a good contrast to what I have in mind about Gifford's sensibility, his way of being. So in this picture by another Hudson River painter, Jerome Thompson, we have, in one sense, a marvelous diagram of what differentiates an artist from the rest of the world, and differentiates and connects. And what do I mean by that? If you look at this foreground group here, poised atop the summit of Mount Mansfield, the tallest peak in Vermont, this is looking west towards Lake Champlain and the Adirondack Mountains in New York. If we have a detail here, you can see that this gentleman is holding up a watch, and the title is called The Belated Party. And these two women, everyone's kind of weary from having gone up there. Hey, we really should be starting down before the sun sets, and that's true. You don't want to be up there at night. There is, meanwhile, another group of three, two figures, an androgynous figure here, and then a woman who are, let's say, hardier than these, like they're more into it than these people. They're more on the edge, and the wind is blowing their hair and their hat. And they're also closer to the one figure who stands, who I think is the artist here. And this artist is having a moment, I think, and we might think of him as a Gifford-like figure in this sense. So, that he's part of the community, he's part of a group of people here, but he's also set apart. He's standing apart, literally, and he's having this connection with, if you follow the spine of the mountain up to its top, there is, I think it's fair to say, there is a cross there's a gully of vertical and horizontal fracture in the rock there. And there's this kind of quasar of light above him. The lower hills make a kind of moody sea all around this figure, whose hat is somewhat sort of echoes the shape of the mountain towards which he stares, which then kind of swoops down in one of its shoulders to kind of encompass his body, which is that shoulder being picked up in the tonality and armature of his dashing cloak. Hey, the artist is communing with higher powers. This is what this picture is saying. He's doing so, I want to say, however, in a very grandiose way. If you go see this painting by Thompson at the Metropolitan, I think of it in relation to the most famous painting by American painting in that museum, Washington Crossing the Delaware. They're very close to one another in the galleries. They're both from the 1850s. They're both about a kind of intrepid exploits, patriotic, national, and military here in this figure, and then aesthetic here, but each is a kind of grand figure of exploit and territorial command, let's say. And what I want to suggest about my hero, Gifford, is that as you look at this painting by him of the same spot, the same place that Thompson was painting, namely Mount Mansfield, with the spine of the mountain up here and the setting sun on Lake Champlain here, is that his conception is far less territorial and acquisitive and even, if you like, manly, and that instead, for his lone contemplator here with his dog, and there's a man climbing up here, there are also a couple of figures here, I would say his mode is very much that of passive receptivity to the landscape rather than kind of manly outreach. And I don't want to make too simplistic a distinction between these modes, right? I mean, obviously they're very fluid, these modes, but Gifford's brilliance, I think, is in painting a sense of quiescence and calm, and a sense that in which the world comes to you rather than you sort of taking control of it aesthetically or politically or however it may be. And though you may say that, this kind of passive mode is in itself, a form of privilege, is a form of, for those who can afford to buy Gifford's paintings or paintings by artists like him, they can more or less delight in this kind of exquisite sensitivity that artists like this can produce, poets really, and as the phrase from our own time goes, which I don't fully agree with, but nonetheless I can certainly understand, happiness is expensive, or poetry is expensive, or moodiness is expensive, right? But what I'd like to say, and this is certainly how I teach, is please, let us not, it's what I tell my students, let's not say that our moments of exquisite sensation on earth need to be ruthlessly tracked back to, the amount of money they cost, whether by virtue of a painting acquired, a painting seen, or a college education secured. Just, I don't want to be that disenchanting, nor perhaps foolishly do I want to believe that the world is that disenchanted. When I look at a Gifford painting like this, the phrase I come up with to describe it, this is another Catskill scene, another twilight scene, another distance scene, I just love this picture, is these paintings are feeling worlds. You know, they don't mean anything, or if they mean something, like the Civil War has ended and there's a kind of battlefield of strewn stumps here in the foreground, or his brother has died, and there's always a feeling of desire and longing and sadness in the beauty of the world for this artist. You know, those sort of what's on the exam type meanings, so-called, are secondary to just the feeling the picture gives as a whole of encountering us, giving itself to us as a feeling world, like a composite of sensations so delicate that it would do harm to them, like trying to catch a butterfly, to, you know, try to name them and identify them, classify them, etc. Right? Somewhere, somehow, all the extravagant softness and care and mercurial silence of our deepest thoughts need to find a place. And, you know, one place where they can be is in that realm that's called art. And although one could say, well, that's Gifford expressing his feelings, and I think I understand that the professor is saying that his feelings, by virtue of his experiences and his capacity to put them into paint, can become, or can activate for us, our own awareness of our own softness, our own distance, our own light, our own reflectiveness. I want to just try to demonstrate in Gifford's own time how this really does happen. And looking at this painting, which I just love by him, called A Coming Storm, so very different from the sunstruck pictures we've been talking about. This is a painting that was owned by, of all people, Edwin Booth, who was the actor brother of of John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. And there he is, looking very glum in a kind of Robert Downey appearance. You know, people say that about Booth, you know, they were startled to see, you know, that he was the same gloomy person at dinner before the show as he was on stage as Hamlet. You know, he was like this painting, which he owned. And then Herman Melville wrote a poem about Gifford's painting and about Edwin Booth in the month April 1865, when this painting was shown, and in which Abraham Lincoln was killed by this man's brother. All feeling hearts must feel for him who felt this picture. A feeling world, remember this, right? But it's all feeling hearts must feel for him who felt this picture. So far we're kind of, you know, this, okay, looking at a painting is about feeling this other person's pain. I think it goes beyond that. Presage dim inklings from the shadowy sphere fixed him and fascinated here. A demon cloud like the mountain one burst on a spirit as mild as this urned lake, the home of shades. But Shakespeare's pensive child, so Booth, never the lines had lightly scanned, steeped in fable, steeped in fate, the Hamlet in his heart was where such hearts can antedate. No utter surprise can come to him who reaches Shakespeare's core. And I think that's Gifford and Booth. That which we seek and shun is there, man's, human being's final lure. Painting as a space of philosophy, which is available to us, much as, say, the play Hamlet is. It's there, you know, it's a free country, download the PDF, et cetera, but, you know, is shunned as much as sought in its wisdom, right? So this, again, is the role of art, but in the place of art, the occupational hazard of being an artist. It's never going to be the next new thing. It's never going to get, you know, 1 million hits or whatever the case may be. But here we have Gifford's fantasy speaking to Booth, and Booth's fascination with this painting speaking to Melville, and it makes a kind of triplicate feeling world from the 1860s, which is direly, powerfully of the real world. You know, this photograph of the Lincoln funeral procession on Pennsylvania Avenue from April 65, this painting, they're from the same feeling world. For us to contemplate the past, you know, and its pull upon us, we need to think of the grief, the sadness, the coming storm that is always mixed with a kind of quiet and reflectiveness in who we are as citizens of this country. And it's a tale, finally, I think, speaking of feeling worlds and speaking of paintings, of plays, of poetry, but also of families. You know, it's a tale of brothers. And you know, I come back to the Giffords, and it makes me think that when I go to Hudson, New York, you know, and I'm looking around, and it's a very, really beautifully restored town from that was basically an industrial wasteland in the 1980s and 90s even, to now a very posh kind of weekend retreat for wealthy New Yorkers with many fancy stores on the main street, Warren Street. But here in this one, this is where Sanford Gifford used to get his paints. And, you know, that place, Hudson, New York, is itself a feeling world, you know, not just works of art, but places hold in us the coming storm, the after quiet, as well as the beautiful calm and poise of American experience. And, you know, I'm fascinated by the story. People have told me that during the whole time Gifford lived in Hudson, there was the jaw of a sperm whale. Remember the city's whaling industry there on Warren Street. It would have been something that Gifford would have known very well. And, you know, this relation between what we think of as just frippery and escape, like, oh, it's a painting, oh, that's nice. And then, I don't know what I want to call it, the depths, the deeps, all that Herman Melville wrote about. They're part of the same world, you know, the little goo that the artist brushes on his palette or mixes on his palette, and then the life of this magnificent creature brought up from the depths of the ocean. It's all part of the same feeling world, and it's in that painting in the De Young. And, you know, looking at Hudson just more broadly and the transformations that began to happen even in Gifford's lifetime. So the transformations in his own hometown that were brought about in part by the industrial activities that made his family's fortune. You know, this is showing South Bay in Hudson, so a bay off the river that was cut off by the introduction of the railroad to Hudson in 1851. And this is now that same bay now, long after it had been filled in because it had become a kind of industrial cesspool after a railroad causeway had cut it off from the river. You see this mountain? This is called Mount Marino. It was on the top of that mountain that in 1845, after dropping out of Brown University, where he studied religion and philosophy, that Gifford decided to make his religion and philosophy be as a painter. And this is Mount Marino here. And here's the abandoned dehumidifier factory there in Hudson. You know, this is a feeling world. To engage with the past of a particular place is to experience that feeling world. Much of the seagoing economy of Hudson in the whaling years was actually not from whaling, which was less financially lucrative than the sealing trade and these ships that would come in from the Pacific had many, many hides of seals. So they would land on islands in the Pacific and club the seals to death, take their hides, and then bring them to Hudson, where they were tanned on Tanner's Lane using the bark of the hemlock tree there. Just a ghostly and very real place, showing that depths and violence are intermixed. Different kinds of assassinations are mixed with the highest beauty in how we think of being alive and think about our connections to past and present. This is the site of the Gifford home, torn down in the 1950s to make a parking lot. There is a house, a derelict house in Hudson now, which gives a little bit of a sense of what the Gifford home might have looked like. And then the Gifford family plot, all 3 rows in all of the Gifford family, facing east towards the Berkshires, in hope of the resurrection, in faith of the resurrection. But with the writing facing west, I can't explain that. Gifford served in the Civil War, by the way, so that's why that flag is there. What beyond this is beyond, I suppose, the morbidity of the art historian's quest to be at the grave of Sanford Gifford is at stake here, for not just for him, but for maybe all of us. I suppose it's everything I've said, right? That in the kind of sunstruck connectivity between the far and the near, which is not only an affair of space, but also of time, we come into a more powerful sense of ourselves, or so we imagine. And we cultivate our souls, our privacy in a way, I think, to give to others. And so let it not be said the next time you're at the museum, or any museum, that there is such a thing as just a landscape painting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am beyond my ability to express my gratitude. I feel transformed by what you have offered to us. So our first question is, would you say Gifford's way of painting a feeling is similar to the way feelings of places were portrayed in the Eastern traditions of painting? Japanese screens displayed at the San Francisco Asian Art Museum come to mind.
Yes, I love that question. I wish I had the expertise to be able to answer it cogently, but I do think there is much in what you say. Not that Gifford would have consciously emulated that mode, but I believe he had much in common with it. And I would like, even on my sabbatical, to learn more about the kind of painting that this questioner has aptly asked about. So thank you for that.
The next question is, do we know if Gifford saw you showed us the plates that he saw of European painting. Was he seeing any images of any other cultures' art?
Well, he did travel to Egypt in the 1870s and to Greece as well. But, you know, the paintings do not betray any evidence of him changing the mode that he established in good old Hudson, New York. You know, there's a novel by William Dean Howells from the 1880s about Americans in Florence, and this man and woman are looking at the Arno, you know, looking down at it from the bridge, and the man says to the woman, you know, well, it's sure is nice, but it's nothing like the Wabash back home, you know. So I guess what I'm suggesting is there can be something beautiful as well as limited about a kind of provincial viewpoint, if that makes sense. Like when I was a graduate student here, my fellow students would be going to Moscow and London and Paris to go study, and I would be going to Hudson, New York, or Yonkers. And I felt perfectly happy. The only thing to say about that is, like Thoreau would say, that sometimes the heaven is in your backyard, right? That the pilgrimage can be out your front door. It doesn't have to be halfway around the world. But having said that, I really like where the questions are coming from. And Gifford was kind of global or cosmopolitan despite himself, I think, is what I'm taking from the questions.
Yes. In this same vein, there's a question as to whether you know about any religious practices such as Quaker silent worship that he may have had any experience with.
Yeah, not Quaker, but certainly he was a person of faith and Protestant faith, and I think you can get that sense from the paintings even without my commentary, that there's the paintings are poignant in the sense that, well, when Gifford died in 1880, he died in 1880. 1882, that's when Nietzsche says God is dead. And that's a complicated statement by Nietzsche, but Gifford's paintings are the paintings of a believer, but not a vulgar believer, right? Because the sun is just as amorphous as it would be in an Emily Dickinson poem, to cite one of Gifford's contemporaries who was maybe our most famous believer, not believer. But I am reminded of something Emily Dickinson said, which is, without belief, the behavior is small. I think one thing one can do with that is to not feel proselytized toward, or like lectured at or sermonized toward when looking at one of these paintings, but so much to sort of be in the presence of belief. And, I know from my own students, from my own teaching, that I had to learn the hard way as a younger professor, but, it's easy to be a skeptic and to be superior to everything. It's harder to believe in something and to try to portray your belief.
Mm-hmm. Another question is, what is your observation of the relationship between the Industrial Revolution and perhaps a sense of loss of some of the beauty and natural ecosystems that Gifford was experiencing as a young boy, and then by the time he was painting some of the paintings you shared, whether there might have been any response to the impact of the Industrial Revolution?
Yes, it's a very logical question. I mean, it's complicated because the Industrial Revolution enables his art, right? His family fortune enables him and his brother Charles to kind of define themselves as artists. And so the purest escape, as it were, is always caught up in all the depredation that I showed there at the end. In fact, I didn't show it because I didn't have the heart to, but, a good Samaritan there in Hudson only 10 years ago found that Gifford's tombstone and a number of others were fallen. And the reason is because there's a big granite quarry there, and they've been blasting there for 100 years, blowing up a mountainside not very far from that cemetery, and selling the gravel, to New York City and so on. So my friend, the Samaritan, has fixed up the plot and made it nice, and that's great. But I guess it's a good metaphor for the way that the industrial progress and quiet, the halo of quietness, are always mixed up together. And I think that's one thing that makes teaching hard and so meaningful for me, is I will not I will not when someone says, well, you don't understand, like beauty is for privileged people or poetry is for privileged people. And, it's all caught up in, the sort of quagmires of environmental and racial hostility and destruction that characterize our lives. Yeah, it is. Thanks. Yeah, got it. Does that mean that we must vanquish the stars that help us guide our lives in the name of some non-existent purity? I don't think so. I need my help where I can get it, and works of art can do it.
In the spirit of the point you're making, would you speak to the landscape composition of the Stanford campus, where the entrance has the face of the church and the quad placed beneath the intersection of the dominant hills in the distance?
Yes, well, it reminds me, your question, well, first of all, Olmsted's design, from what I know of it, would fit what the Hudson River painters would call a middle landscape, which just basically means like a reconciliation of nature and culture, where instead of the mountain looming in a kind of impending avalanche way over some tiny little hut, which Gifford's forebears tended to paint in those terms, instead it's all, it's a nice reconciliation. And I think Stanford's campus does that. What the question also makes me think of is, however, the funereal quality of the beauty of Stanford's landscape, the whole campus having been established after a death and in honor of a dead son, and the ankh of the Egyptianness of the campus, I think, would be interesting to think about in terms of Gifford, because his son is always an Egyptian son, of it's an eternal life, and a kind of there's a kind of grave or funereal quality to it too.
You shared your insights about Gifford's exploration of the range of emotions that is available to us as humans in his paintings. Do you see any parallel with Jane Stanford's exploration of her grief and the paintings she collected and the composition that Gifford shared?
Yes. Yeah, I appreciate very much the parallel. I think I wish Jane Stanford had acquired a Gifford. The fact that she didn't suggests a lot. I think her taste did not run to the sort of soft and quiet. But she comes from New York State too, if I'm not mistaken, and is not that much younger, or was born just a little later than Gifford, I believe. And it's interesting that they come out of the same world. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is another question. I think there is a sense of sublime in Gifford's paintings rather than a sense of manifest destiny. How does this compare to other landscape painters of the time?
I think there was no one like Gifford for painting, as it were, almost nothing at all. There's no big event, there's no wagon train. So yes, I agree that it's not a manifest destiny kind of picture. It's not like Washington crossing the Delaware or the rainy season in the tropics. But I think he's probably unique in this way of showing nothing, almost nothing, and then kind of inviting us into a space where we can dream. I was listening to sports radio today, and one athlete or announcer was saying that they, quote unquote, get in and out of Twitter really fast because it's so toxic. And I was just saying out loud, as I was stuck in traffic after driving to return my daughter's field hockey uniform after the last day of the season. Why not just not be on Twitter? You know, that would tend to solve a lot of that. So I guess my point is, Gifford creates a space where we're not judged or commanded or told that we're wrong or stupid or ignorant or great, for that matter. There's no commentary at all. So if that's what the questioner means by sublime, then yes, I'll go with that.
Thank you. You've referenced your conversations with students, and the question is, have you invited students to go to a rooftop on the Stanford campus and watch the sunset or the sunrise?
Well, the reason I'm on sabbatical is because I've just finished 6 years as chair, and I know that I cannot let students go on the rooftop of our building, because it's a security hazard as well as a personal injury hazard. So far from encouraging them, I have to actually restrict that. But one doesn't have to actually see a sunset to actually have that feeling that Gifford's paintings portray. And that's what I'm looking for in my teaching, you know, is that moment of softness, quietness, vulnerability, which is obviously present for all of us every day, and which is well guarded by all of us, which makes whatever it is, a painting, a poem, a lecture, that actually happens to name that feeling or describe that feeling, at least sometimes, a great gift.
Thank you, Professor Nemerov. This individual says, do you have any advice for cultivating this sense of enchantment and engagement in the feeling world when so many forces pull us in other directions?
Yes, it's such a good question. My wife says I should try meditating, but I say, well, I kind of am meditating most all the time anyway. So I think what I said about attention and grace, I think is important. That attention is a form of prayer, as the philosopher Simone Weil said. Put into practice, I might say this: next time you go to an art museum, instead of, if this indeed is your mode, looking at everything for 3 seconds, how about look at one thing, which is not necessarily something that you've been told to see, but something that you find interesting, whether you know of the artist or not. And look at it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour or 90 seconds, and then leave. Then that day will be always the day that you went to see that work of art. And maybe, just maybe, it will cease being a so-called work of art, which as a phrase means like a kind of different, specialized world that, you know, is separated from our own feelings by all the rigid boundaries that we use to structure our lives. And instead, you'll see it as a part of you.
Thank you. If we may have one more question, this individual writes, could Gifford, as a student of religion at Brown, have encountered the medieval mystical Christian text titled The Cloud of Unknowing? The diffuse sun obscured by haze recalls this work and its notion of the ineffable divine, and hence, quote, the cloud interposed between God and human reasoning.
That's a brilliant question. I think I haven't seen Gifford's transcripts from Brown or read the documents that say what classes he took, but I agree with the questioner that it's fascinating to think about what religion he did study and the relation of that to his painting. And you know, even if he turns out not to have studied those particular mystics, I think one could put him into a conversation with those mystics in a way that allows allows them to animate one another, right? So when we think of going to a town like Hudson, New York, or let's say somewhere close to us, like Sonoma, or I don't know, so anywhere around here, the word mystic doesn't come to mind, right? We're accustomed to thinking of that in approved places, of cosmological faith, St. Peter's or something like that. But why not? The sky reflecting off the homeliest puddle in some kind of industrial dredge land, in some American locale, has a lot of grace. It can, it's not easy or simple, but to the mind accustomed to look, I think that stuff just gives and gives.
Thank you, Professor Nemerov. Thank you for your inspiring talk and for illuminating the meditations offered to us through Sanford Gifford's landscape paintings. Thank you.